In 1695, a British captain named Henry Avery pulled off the most audacious heist in maritime history. He intercepted the Ganges Sawai, the personal treasure ship of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, off the coast of India and stripped it of gold and gems worth somewhere between 300,000 and 600,000 pounds sterling. Avery and his crew scattered to the winds. Most of them were never caught, and the gold, the jewels, the silver, the entire weight of an emperor's fortune vanished. Some of it surfaced in Ireland. Some of it appeared in the American colonies. Most of it was never recovered. And every sailor who heard the story said the same thing in the years that followed. That gold was cursed, that none of the men who touched it would know peace, that the treasure itself carried something older than courts and empires and laws, something that followed. They said this quietly, in the way people say things they half believe and half fear to examine too closely. They said it because the men who took that gold did, in fact, mostly die badly, and because sailors in the age of sail needed to explain why some things couldn't be explained any other way. This is the story of the curse, not as superstition, not as mythology dressed up in historical costume, as a living belief system that shaped the decisions of real men sailing real ships, that influenced which prizes were taken and which were avoided, that determined whether a crew would follow their captain into an attack or lay down their weapons and refuse. The curse of pirates' gold was not a fairy tale. It was a moral framework, a psychological weapon, and a genuine expression of terror from men who had seen too much to dismiss the idea that the world punished those who violated its patterns. Before a single coin enters the story, you need the map. The Atlantic in 1690 is divided into 3 brutal economies, running simultaneously, all of them feeding each other, all of them dependent on the same ocean roads. From Europe to West Africa, trade goods, weapons, and cloth moving south and east. From West Africa to the Americas, enslaved people moving west in the holds of ships, scrubbed and refitted in the harbors of Barbados and Jamaica and Virginia. From the Americas back to Europe, sugar, tobacco, silver, indigo, the raw material of every luxury the Old World consumed. The Spanish portion of this system ran heavy with silver. The Potosi mines in what is now Bolivia were producing more silver than the rest of the world combined, and that silver moved north through the Americas, loaded onto treasure galleons in Portobelo and Cartagena, and shipped across the Atlantic to Seville, where it funded everything from Spanish armies in the Netherlands to Portuguese spice routes in Asia. Every sailor alive knew this map. They knew where the money moved and what routes it took, and approximately when the great convoys assembled. And every pirate alive knew that touching that silver was the most dangerous thing a man could do. Not just because the Spanish Navy would hunt you, not just because the gallows waited at Port Royal and Charlestown and Nassau, but because the silver had a history, and the history was dark, and somewhere in that darkness, the sailors said, something watched. The 8 reals coin, the piece of 8. 8 reals was a day's wage for a skilled craftsman in 17th century Spain. Multiply that by the tens of millions of pieces minted annually at Potosi and Mexico City, and you have the blood supply of the global economy. And each one of those coins was minted by forced labor. Indigenous men conscripted into the mines under a system called the mita, a Spanish adaptation of an Incan labor tribute transformed from a community obligation into something closer to a death sentence. The mortality rate at Potosi in the 17th century was high enough that the Spanish crown periodically had to draft men from communities hundreds of miles away because the nearby populations had been reduced below functional levels. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. The silver that ran through every pirate's fingers had been dug out of a mountain by men who were dying to produce it. That was not metaphor. That was the economic foundation of the world the pirates robbed. And the sailors knew it, or knew something of it, in the way people who live inside a system understand its rough shape without ever reading the official reports. They knew the silver had come from somewhere terrible. They knew the men who produced it had not done so willingly. And in the moral framework of the early modern Atlantic, that knowledge translated directly into the language of the curse. Blood silver, some called it, the weight of the dead. You could spend it, yes. You could divide it among your crew by the articles. But it watched you. It waited. It had expectations. The concept of cursed treasure is older than Spain's colonial project and older than the specific superstitions the Spanish sailors carried across the Atlantic. The Inca, whose empire the Spanish dismantled in the 1530s, understood gold and silver as sacred materials. They called gold the sweat of the sun and silver the tears of the moon, and they did not use them as currency. They used them as offerings, as architectural elements of temples, as objects whose value was entirely spiritual rather than commercial. When the Spanish melted down Incan goldwork to mint coins, they were not simply destroying art. They were, in the belief system of the people who made those objects, committing a sacrilege with consequences. The Spanish missionaries who traveled with the conquistadors recorded stories of curses on Inca gold going back to the 1530s. Men who looted Inca temples died mysteriously. Expeditions that carried plundered sacred objects were beset by storms and disease at rates that seemed to exceed expectations, at least to the men keeping the records. What we can determine is that the belief was established early, that the Spanish themselves, the very people doing the looting, accepted on some level that the objects they were taking carried a quality that made them dangerous. By the time the pirate era reaches its height, in the 1680s through the 1720s, this belief has been marinated in Atlantic culture for 150 years. It has mixed with African spiritual traditions brought across in the holds of slave ships. It has absorbed elements of European folk belief about the danger of ill-gotten gains. It has been shaped by the specific conditions of life at sea, where men lived close to death and had plenty of time to notice patterns and tell each other stories in the dark hours of the watch. The result is a belief system that is not any single tradition, but an amalgam, uniquely Caribbean, uniquely Atlantic, uniquely the product of the age of sail. And at its center is a simple proposition. There is treasure in the world that has been separated from its rightful owners by violence. That treasure carries the weight of that violence, and if you take it for your own, the weight comes with it. Henry Avery understood this dynamic in purely practical terms. In 1695, he coordinated the capture of the Ganges Sawai by positioning himself correctly and attacking at precisely the right moment. What happened after was chaos and atrocity. The accounts are graphic and consistent across multiple sources. Avery's men committed acts during the taking of that ship that would echo through diplomatic dispatches for decades. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb was furious in a way that disrupted British trade with India for years afterward. English merchants in Surat were attacked by mobs. The East India Company faced a diplomatic crisis that cost it enormous resources to resolve. All of this because of the weight that came with that particular gold. Avery disappeared. He had planned carefully, and he vanished effectively. But the men around him did not all vanish as effectively. Several of his crew were captured and tried in London in 1696, the first time pirates had been tried in England under the new Admiralty Act. 6 of them were hanged. Others, scattered through the American colonies and Ireland and the Caribbean, died poor and frightened. A pamphlet published around 1709, possibly by Daniel Defoe, described Avery himself ending his days destitute in a village in Devon, having been stripped of his fortune by merchants who cheated him, unable to spend what he'd taken because spending it would have identified him. He died broke. The gold was gone. The man was reduced to the same nothing he'd been before he took it. Whether that story is true doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is that people believed it and that they interpreted it in a specific way. Avery had taken blood treasure, the kind with weight attached, and the weight had found him eventually. This was not a morality tale produced by the state or the church to discourage piracy. It was a story produced by the pirate community itself, circulated among the men most likely to attempt the same thing, and it carried a warning that no proclamation from the Board of Trade could match. The warning was simple. That kind of money costs you more than it gives you, not because of law enforcement, because of something else, something the sailors called different things in different languages, but which they all understood was real. The practice of burying treasure was real and widespread, not as a romantic gesture or a clever plot device for later fiction, but as practical risk management. A pirate captain who had accumulated significant wealth and needed to visit a port where he might be recognized could not walk around with a chest of silver on his back. Burying it in a known location and returning for it later was the sensible thing to do. The problem was that the men who dug the hole and watched you put the box in it now knew where the box was. And dead men don't come back for shares. The stories that circulated in Nassau and Port Royal and Tortuga about buried treasure shared a common structure. The captain buries the gold. He kills the men who helped him bury it, or tries to. The gold then becomes anchored to that spot in a way that was understood as more than physical. The violence that sealed the burial site bound the treasure to the place, and the bound treasure, watched over by the spirits of the men killed to keep the secret, resisted recovery. Men who went looking for such treasure reported strange things. Lights moving in the darkness near the burial site, equipment that stopped working at critical moments, the sense of being watched from all sides. Whether the buried treasure existed at all in many cases is irrelevant to the functional role the belief played. It meant that a cache of cursed gold could not simply be taken by any man who found out where it was. It required something more, a proper understanding of what you were dealing with. Or, more practically, it required that you not take it at all, that you leave it where it was, and accept that some gold was not meant to be spent. The legend of Captain Kidd's buried treasure is the clearest example in the historical record of how this belief system functioned in practice. William Kidd was a Scottish privateer who went to sea in 1696 with a commission from a syndicate of London investors to hunt pirates in the Indian Ocean. Kidd captured at least one significant prize, the Quedagh Merchant, an Armenian ship carrying goods owned by officials of the Mughal court, a prize of dubious legality. He returned to the Caribbean in 1699 and buried a significant portion of his treasure on Gardiner's Island near the tip of Long Island, while he attempted to negotiate his way back to legitimacy with his backers in London. The negotiation failed. Kidd was arrested, sent to England, tried, and hanged at Execution Dock in London in May 1701. His body was suspended in an iron cage over the Thames for 3 years as a warning to other mariners. The treasure buried on Gardiner's Island was recovered by colonial authorities and shipped to London as evidence at his trial. Kidd died maintaining that more treasure existed elsewhere, that he had caches he could reveal if given clemency. Within a decade of his death, the legend had already transformed him. Stories of his hidden treasure spread through the Atlantic world with a velocity completely disproportionate to the relatively modest size of what he had actually buried. Treasure hunters searched the coastlines of New England, the Caribbean, Nova Scotia, Madagascar, and a dozen other locations. None of them found anything substantial, and the reason the legend gave for why they couldn't find it was always the same. The gold was watching. The circumstances of its burial had invested it with a quality that protected it from anyone who approached it for purely mercenary reasons. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the Pirate Code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. You didn't find Kidd's gold because Kidd's gold didn't want to be found. This is psychologically elegant as a belief system because it is completely unfalsifiable. Every failed treasure hunt confirms the belief. Every strange occurrence during the search confirms it. The belief is self-sealing. It cannot be disproven by experience because every possible experience has been incorporated into its explanatory framework in advance. The West African dimension of the curse belief is the element most consistently omitted from the popular accounts and most important for understanding how the belief functioned with its full complexity. A substantial portion of pirate crews in the Golden Age period were men of African descent, some formerly enslaved, some born free in Caribbean communities of mixed heritage, some directly from the West African coast. These men brought with them spiritual frameworks for understanding the world that were both more sophisticated and more specific than the European folk beliefs about ill-gotten gains. In many West African traditional systems, wealth is understood as a relationship, not a possession. You do not simply have money. You have a relationship with money, and that relationship has terms. If the terms are violated, if the wealth was acquired through actions that damage the relationships it depended on, the wealth itself becomes a liability. It doesn't just stop helping you, it actively turns against you. When these frameworks arrived in the Caribbean and mixed with European folk belief and indigenous American spiritual tradition, the resulting hybrid was not a confused muddle. It was something more complex than any of its sources, a belief system adapted to the specific conditions of the Atlantic world, where men of multiple origins lived in close quarters under extreme stress and needed frameworks for making sense of what they were doing. The precautions were real and varied. Some crews performed rituals before dividing captured cargo, rituals that acknowledged the nature of what they were handling. Some captains refused to touch certain categories of treasure directly, insisting that the quartermaster handle the division. Some men wore protective objects, rings or medallions, or small bags of herbs and earth, understood to filter out the curse inherent in certain kinds of wealth. These were not theatrical performances. They were functional behaviors, as practical as tightening the rigging before a storm. Colonial governors who tried to extract treasure location information from convicted pirates often found their informants willing to discuss everything about their operational history and completely unwilling to discuss buried gold. The distinction was not strategic silence. It was fear of a specific and understood category of harm. The Whydah is the cleanest documentary case study for how the curse belief functioned in real time. The Whydah was a slaving vessel, purpose-built for the transatlantic trade, captured off the Bahamas in February 1717 by Samuel Bellamy. Bellamy was 28 years old, English-born, and by all accounts genuinely charismatic. He was known as Black Sam, apparently for the black hair he wore loose rather than powdering it in the fashionable style of the period, a small act of sartorial politics that his crew read as a statement about who he was and what he thought of the world he was defying. The Whydah was a prize of extraordinary value. She was fast, well-armed, and had been carrying cargo from her slaving voyages that included coin and trade goods worth tens of thousands of pounds. Bellamy converted her into his flagship and spent the next few months working the American coast, accumulating prizes at a rate that made him one of the most successful pirates of his era in a very short time. By the spring of 1717, he had taken somewhere between 50 and 100 vessels, and his hold was heavy with gold, silver, ivory, and every kind of portable value that the Atlantic trade could produce. The Whydah herself was the problem. She had been built for a specific and terrible purpose. She had made at least one complete slaving voyage, carrying hundreds of men, women, and children in conditions designed to deliver as many of them alive as possible while fitting as many as possible into the available space. The mortality rate on slaving voyages of the period ran between 12% and 30% in transit. And in the moral framework of the Atlantic curse tradition, a vessel literally built on the economics of the slave trade was not a neutral object. It was an object with a history that could not be separated from what it now carried. Bellamy's crew understood this, or some of them did. The Whydah attracted men from across the full spectrum of Atlantic origins. There were English and Scottish and Irish sailors aboard. There were black sailors, some of them formerly enslaved. There were Mosquito Coast indigenous men who had been sailing with pirates since the buccaneering era of the previous century. The belief systems represented on that single ship were more various than most academic theology departments. And the conversation those belief systems had with each other, in the mess and the hold, and during the night watches, produced something specific about the Whydah: a reputation, a sense that the ship carried more than its physical cargo. What happened in April 1717 is documented better than most events in pirate history because it produced physical evidence that survived and was eventually recovered. Bellamy was sailing north along the New England coast when he encountered a storm of exceptional violence on the night of April 26th. The Whydah drove onto the shoals of Cape Cod in the dark in 40-foot seas and went down in water shallow enough that the survivors could see the lights on shore. Of approximately 146 men aboard, 2 survived. The wreck and its contents scattered across the seafloor and into the beach. The immediate interpretation among the sailors who heard about it over the following weeks and months was confirmation of what had been suspected. The Whydah had been carrying too much cursed gold from too many sources with too much violence in its history, and the weight of it had finally expressed itself. This was not the official interpretation. The official interpretation was that Bellamy had been unlucky in his navigation and unlucky in the weather. But the official interpretation was not the one that circulated in the harbors and the taverns where sailors discussed their profession. The physical evidence recovered from the Whydah by archaeologist Barry Clifford starting in 1984 includes something that the curse narrative, if it were pure invention, would not predict. Among the objects recovered from the seafloor was a significant quantity of West African jewelry, gold jewelry of a specific type associated with ritual practice in several West African traditions. This jewelry was not cargo. It was not part of any manifest. It was personal property, worn or carried by individual crew members for spiritual protection. These were the practical measures that the crews of the period employed against the specific hazard they understood to attend the kind of work they were doing. That material evidence tells you something important. It tells you that the belief was not abstract. It was embodied in objects that men carried against their skin, objects they considered important enough to bring onto a vessel they were not sure they could trust. The men of the Whydah knew at some level what they were sailing on, and they prepared accordingly. The preparations were not sufficient, or the storm was stronger than the preparations could address, or, in the language of the tradition, the weight of what the Whydah carried was simply too much to be balanced by any individual countermeasure. The last great generation of Atlantic pirates, the men who built and lost Nassau between 1713 and 1718, died with the cursed narrative fully formed around them. Blackbeard's head on a bowsprit, Vane in a gibbet at the entrance to Port Royal Harbor, Rackham's body in an iron cage at Rackham's Cay, where it still gives its name to the place 300 years later. These deaths were not interpreted by their community as simply the legal consequence of a criminal career. They were interpreted as the expression of the weight that had accumulated on those men, the weight of the gold they had taken, the weight of the violence that had attended its taking and its eventual loss. The community that interpreted them this way was not wrong about everything. They were wrong about the supernatural causation, or at least the causal mechanism was not what they described. But they were not wrong that the wealth carried a weight, that the circumstances of its origin followed it through its subsequent history, that men who touched certain kinds of treasure were taking on something beyond the simple material value of the coins. They were right about the shape of the thing, even if they were wrong about its ultimate nature. The most durable aspect of the curse of pirates' gold is the reason it has survived as a living tradition into the present. It tells a truth about wealth and violence that the official economic history of the era preferred to leave unexamined. It says that the way money is made determines what money does to the people who hold it. It says that treasure separated from its origin by force carries that force within it. It says that there is no such thing as clean money that was made dirty, that the history of an object cannot be separated from the object, that what you hold holds you. The sailors who believed this were not primitive. They were among the most practically experienced observers of the global economy in their era, men who had touched almost every category of wealth the Atlantic produced, and who had very specific empirical reasons for the distinctions they drew. Their belief system was a response to the world they actually lived in, a world in which the most visible concentrations of wealth were built on the most visible concentrations of suffering, and in which the connection between those two facts was something that the people who benefited from the wealth were very strongly motivated to deny. The curse said the connection was real, that it had consequences, that the gold remembered where it had been. The Golden Age of Piracy ended in the 1720s, but the belief in cursed treasure did not end with it. It moved. It transformed. It went into the folk traditions of the Caribbean and the coastal American South and the Atlantic island communities and the West African diaspora. It influenced the treasure-hunting traditions of the 19th century. It shaped the way fiction understood pirate gold from Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island forward. It is alive in some form in every story ever told about wealth that was taken rather than earned, about money that corrupts the hands it passes through, about the specific hazard of holding something paid for in blood. The sailors who built that belief did not know they were creating a tradition that would outlast the age that produced it. They were just trying to understand what they were doing and to survive it. They looked at the gold in their hands and they felt its weight, and they said, correctly, that the weight was more than the weight of the metal, that there was something else in it, something that watched and waited and expressed itself through the lives of the men who forgot to take it seriously. And somewhere in the Atlantic seafloor, in the dark water off Cape Cod, and in the shallow channels of the Bahamas, and off the coast of West Africa, where Bartholomew Roberts's royal fortune went down, the old treasure rests, undisturbed, still watched over, still carrying whatever it is it carries. The sailors said it could feel you looking at it. They said it knew the difference between someone who understood what they were dealing with and someone who didn't. They said the ones who understood left it alone. They went home and told the story instead. And the story, which has no weight and carries no curse and costs the teller nothing but time, has lasted longer than any of the gold.